Welcome to our continuing 2019 educational webinar series. I am Catherine Short, Partnership Marketing Manager for First Healthcare Compliance. At First Healthcare Compliance, we help you with a comprehensive compliance management solution tailored to your business. A hospital, hospital network, healthcare practice of any size, billing company, or skilled nursing facility. As part of our complimentary educational webinar series, we bring you experts from around the country to discuss relevant topics in the healthcare industry. We are so pleased to have Andrew B. Wilson, an attorney and legislative specialist in Morris James LLP's Healthcare Industry and Government Regulations Groups, with us today. Mr. Wilson assists clinicians and their practices through licensing questions, how to expand their business and billing, and regulatory compliance. He also acts as a voice in the healthcare policy discussion, speaking on behalf of physicians and the Medical Society of Delaware, advocating for patient access to efficient and cost-effective quality care. Mr. Wilson started his career as counsel in the New York State Senate. He was counsel to 4 senators, as well as to the Alcoholism and Drug Abuse Committee. In addition to building an expertise in health law and policy, Mr. Wilson has worked on many political campaigns ranging from volunteer to kitchen cabinet to statewide campaign manager, where he has built an expertise in campaign and election law. He has been voted to top healthcare attorney by his peers in the Delaware Bar and received the 40 Under 40 distinction from Delaware Business Times. He has received his BA degree from St. Lawrence University and his JD degree from Albany Law School. Mr. Wilson is a member of the American Bar Association, the American Society of Medical Association Counsel, and the Delaware State Bar Association, where he co-chairs the Health Law section. A copy of the slides is available for download on the control panel. Feel free to submit questions into the question box on your control panel during the presentation. We will address questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Your PACOM and PMI CEU certificates will be emailed to you following the broadcast. Your PACOM certificate will come directly from PACOM, and your PMI certificate will come from our email. There is no need to request either one. Additional CEU opportunities will be available to BC Advantage members following the live broadcast. See their website for details. A download of the handout is available with the button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So, Drew, welcome.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks for having me. I've been a big fan of the program for a while, so I'm thrilled to be here. We were chatting a little bit ahead of time, and I mean in all earnestness when I say that telemedicine is deeply exciting to me. I think it's almost an inevitable wave of the future, and I think that most practices really do see it as an opportunity, as a way to bridge gaps to see their patients more efficiently. And if we're looking down at the future of healthcare in terms of how practices will be reimbursed, telemedicine makes a lot of sense. And so for everyone tuning in, our goals here today are really more of a high-level look at the issues that you might be questioning if you're trying to figure out how how telemedicine and telehealth fits into your practice, how it fits into your workflow, and how it is reimbursed, essentially. We're going to use Delaware as a model, but don't let that scare you off. Delaware just happens to be my home state. I helped draft Delaware's telemedicine law, House Bill 69, which we passed in 2015. As Catherine mentioned, I'm a lawyer by day, but I really am a policy wonk at heart. I began in the New York State Senate. I have a background really in addiction and opiate abuse, which has been a huge boon considering the crisis that we're in now. And so I love the policy aspect of all this. So we might be a little policy heavy along the way, but I'll use Delaware statute kind of as a guidepost. So I worked on the statute during my time in-house at the Medical Society of Delaware. And so policy was the bread and butter, and the Medical Society was really a voice and a leader in this segment, along in partnership with the Delaware Telehealth Coalition, which I think now is up to about probably 200 organizations around the state, ranging from anywhere from like a direct-to-consumer telemedicine business to your average practice to state entities and myself even. I sit on the telehealth steering committee today. So we're constantly looking at how to make a productive and conducive landscape for telemedicine here in Delaware. Although there are states around the country that are fantastic models, there's a lot of really good innovation and fantastic ways to use telemedicine that we're seeing out there. So while we're going to use Delaware, it's certainly almost happening definitely in your own backyard. So don't be turned off by the Delaware aspect of it. And as a little bit of background in terms of how I got into the legal side of things, Medical Society of Delaware really has a mission for how to make physicians' lives easier, how to make practices run more efficiently. If you're a practice manager or you're a clinician, and even if you're employed or if you're in your own practice, you know that the practice of medicine has become wildly regulated over the last years, especially in the last several years. It's become harder and harder to actually do the medicine. I hear on a daily basis from physicians who come to me and say, I got into this business to help people, and now I feel like I spend most of my time filling data fields into computer programs. And so it's not as fulfilling as it used to be. And so in that landscape, if I say telemedicine, a lot of practices and a lot of clinicians will say, listen, that just sounds like another hassle. It sounds like another thing that's going to be like an EMR that's going to be really just make my life more difficult. And so there's, and rightfully so. I mean, practice of medicine has kind of been burned a little bit by technology use, but earnestly, I will say with every fiber of my being, I mean, telemedicine is not that with the proper use of it, that it really is a practice saver, that it'll give you a healthier patient population and it'll ultimately end up saving you time. It also makes a lot of business sense, especially if you're in a state like Delaware that's past some payment parity. And so when I came into the law firm, it was really carrying that philosophy as well, saying that we are here to try to make physicians' lives easier, and that physicians are people too, clinicians are people too. And so while I work specifically in healthcare, we really do try to address everything that surrounds a physician's life, a clinician's life, a practice manager's life, everything from real estate closings to wills. And so I've been very happy here at Morris James over the past several years. Because I am an attorney, I'll give you just a very basic sort of disclosure slash kind of caveat here. So this presentation cannot be considered legal advice. My presenting and you receiving the following information does not create an attorney-client relationship between us. Please consult an attorney to receive legal advice relating to the particular facts and circumstances of any questions or concerns you have relating to your practice. And of course, I'd be happy to help with that if at all appropriate. But for today, we're sort of talking high level. So if we were in person, I would ask the group sort of earnestly a question of, just off the knee-jerk reaction coming into a room, what do most people think telemedicine is? And since this is a webinar and I can't hear a lot of you right now, I'll ask it more rhetorically, and I'll give you the answer, the technical answer. So what you see right now, this is the working definition of telemedicine, which is simply the remote diagnosis and treatment of patients by means of telecommunications technology. So to say it again, the remote diagnosis and treatment of patients by means of telecommunications technology. And I'm repeating it because it seems like a very simple statement, but there's a lot of stuff packed in here that we'll kind of unpack along the way. So, remote diagnosis, how remote do we have to be? Diagnosis is the actual medicine of it. Well, diagnosis and treatment is the actual medicine of it. I have a lot of, especially older physicians, who are skeptical that telemedicine could ever play a role in the practice of medicine itself. And telecommunications technology, whenever I throw out something like that, almost everybody thinks about some sort of future tech, some crazy scheme where like a battlefield medic could be wearing gloves and like there's a surgeon 1,000 miles away and there's the surgeon's doing the surgery and using these gloves, so the battlefield medic is like, doing all the stuff on the wounded soldier. Anyway, the point being that it's much more simple than that. And so let's do just kind of a level set here and look backwards before we look at where we are now. And so in 1925, Hugo Gernsback is the namesake for the Hugo Awards for all you fellow sci-fi nerds out there. And in 1925, Hugo had envisioned what you see here, which is called a teledactyl. And so you'll notice a lot of familiar elements here. You have a screen, you've got some wires, you've got your physician and your nurse, and you've got your patient. And really what it was, if we break the word apart, teledactyl, tele means distance, dactyl means finger actually here. So what you're seeing is that you've got a patient who's far away, so they're distant, that's the tele part. And you've got a physician using these heat and pressure sensitive fingers that he's guiding remotely to feel the patient and do the medicine and the diagnosis. And so it's not a new idea by any means. One of the classic real examples, although this was a future prognostication that we're almost 100 years from now, is when we sent our astronauts to the moon. All of the heart monitoring, all of the oxygen usage monitoring, all of that stuff was really some of the basic use of telemedicine. We think about when we send our Arctic explorers out, we track them. We don't send the doctors along the way. We keep our doctors here at home, but we care about how they're doing. And so we track them and we provide medicine to them as best as we can from a distance. And so there's not, we have a strong tradition, and those are very sort of outlandish examples, but they're very real examples of how telemedicine's been around for 50-something years. And if you want to be something very basic and mundane, almost every practice I've talked to ever says that they'll see a patient in person and then they'll have a phone call later and follow up and see how people are doing, see how they're reacting to the meds, see how the healing of the incision is going. And that's also telemedicine. You're using telecommunications technology to bridge a gap to follow up on the medicine for the patient. And so it really is as mundane as that. But really what we're going to be talking about today it looks a little bit more like this. So the technology that's proliferated, cell phones, smartphones are now everywhere. Almost every computer has some sort of if it doesn't have a camera built in it like a laptop, you can add one like at the desktop on the top right. So the technology is actually incredibly common. There was a very, very brief moment in time when hospital systems in particular were investing in these big honking $20,000, $30,000 carts that were being pulled around room to room. And because that was kind of the early viewpoint of it, that's the image that got stuck in people's minds. But that's not really what we're talking about now. Right now, the technology is deeply accessible. And part of it's because of the investment that we've made. There's actually a recent Forbes article, I think just in July, that was estimating that by 2021, the telemedicine industry as a whole, and there's a lot packed into there, will be worth about $66 billion. The VA even has been investing almost 1.8 to almost $2 billion a year in their telemedicine. And they've been really a driver of policy because they're trying to figure out how do they get their clinicians from a concentrated area out to a vast population of veterans. And that's no different than if you think about your own patients and how you're supposed to reach them. It's good to know that the tools are as simple as what you probably have in your pocket and in front of you right now. How you use that, though, so the one that we think about the most when we think about telemedicine, or we should, is a live video. So you think about like a FaceTime or a Skype or as sort of the everyday commercial avenues for that kind of thing. Store and forward asynchronous. That sounds kind of bizarre, but it's as simple as if you're in pathology or radiology, if you took an X-ray and you put it into a computer and you send it over via email, and then you talked about it with the other physician later during a consultation, that's an asynchronous telemedicine visit. It's as simple as that. It could also be taking somebody's history ahead of time so that you've got all of their information in front of you without even seeing the patient. So somebody else, a nurse or even an MA, does the intake and the history, and then remotely, and then the physician, when they're actually doing the actual exam in person, has that information in front of them. There's an asynchronous collection and use. Remote patient monitoring. So I'll kind of loop that for a moment in with mHealth. A lot of us have Apple Watches or Fitbits, and it can be as simple as that in terms of the clinical data that's being collected on them being used by the clinician later to track them. But of course, those are very basic examples. They can become incredibly elaborate as well. I've worked with a practice in the past that has been following asthma patients essentially, and they don't know when an asthma patient is using their inhaler, and so they actually have kind of a twofold prong on it where they put a little sensor on the asthma inhaler, and every time the patient uses the inhaler, it sets the trigger off so that they have a data point on, oh, look, like the patient actually used the inhaler then, or the nebulizer. And then you can also track things like, you can put like a band around their chest so you can see how they're breathing and their heart rate and the like. So the point being that you don't have to be with the patient to be collecting very, very important clinical data. And mobile health, mHealth, is a broad topic. It's also relatively controversial right now, not because of the potential of the field, but because the regulation of it is kind of spotty. It's very easy to bring to make a phone app, for instance, and put it on iTunes, and people start downloading it thinking that it's been fully vetted and brought to the market and is a safe medical tool, and that's not always the case. So out of all the different modalities, that's one area that I'd urge a little bit of caution, but that can be a whole nother presentation for another day. So let's talk just some basic terminology here. So for purposes today, telemedicine is more about the patient to practitioner, that discrete interaction, the actual medicine that is delivered. Telehealth is kind of everything around it. It's an umbrella term, so telemedicine is in it, but it's also things like the patient records, patient education, follow-ups, the sort of the non-medical interactions. And this one is the following two terms are ones that get backwards all the time. So the most providers that I work with, the intuitive way that they think about it is that the medicine originates from them. It's their expertise and their diagnostic skills. But from a telemedicine and telehealth standpoint, the originating site is with the patient, and the distant site is with the provider. And so the medicine really starts with the patient itself in sort of telemedicine lingo, and that's important for later in the presentation when we talk a little bit more about compliance and licensing, because you always have to think about where the patient actually is. So this is a very wordy slide, but along the way, I just want to give you examples of language from Delaware's telemedicine law. And actually the citation throughout, I've got 16 throughout. It's actually Title 24 if there are lawyers looking in and they want to go and try to find it. But this is a very basic definition of telemedicine. Again, a form of telehealth, which is the delivery of clinical healthcare services. And then I'm going to kind of skip down because there's a lot of stuff baked in there. But you've got, it's the patient's healthcare by a healthcare provider practicing. So we're down here. Within his or her scope of practice that would be practiced in person with the patient. And so it's easy when we're talking in statutory language, when we're talking about telemedicine. If you're a practice and you're thinking about telemedicine, most practitioners will think of telemedicine as something other, something different than what they do now. And really, if there's one thing that you really take away from the day, it's not that telemedicine is not something else. You can't practice to a different standard of care just because you're using telemedicine. The medicine is the standard of care of what you do now in person. And so even if you're a telemedicine practitioner right now, I'd urge you to kind of think about what you're doing in terms of how you're delivering your healthcare and your services to patients, and really kind of take a step back. I'll get practices all the time who will call me and say, hey, can I do this type of medicine? Can I deliver this kind of treatment? And inevitably, I almost always turn it around because I'm not a practitioner, In fact, if the worst case scenario happened and we wound up in court for some reason, I would actually be calling another physician to try and get their expert testimony. I mean, my opinion of it is not what's important. What's important is that I turn it around and I say, well, do you think that if that patient was directly in front of you inside of your practice that you could do it that way? And then that's kind of the way to think about it, because you can't lower your standard of care because you're using technology and you're apart from the patient. And so a classic example that pops up all the time is, and it's a heated debate, quite frankly, is whether or not things like ear infections can be done via telemedicine. And so, the obvious answer from my perspective is that, if you are a physician using telemedicine, or just using medicine at all, the first thing you do is pull the patient into your exam room and you look in their ear and see what you can see. And so if you're just over the phone, you almost definitely can't see in their ear. You're kind of taking their description. They might not have the right words. They might have the vocabulary to really describe what's happening to them. And if you're using an audio and a visual, which is kind of the gold standard and often we'll talk about it later, the required way to be seeing patients in Delaware, at least, the audio visual portion of it, I mean, you've got to be able to see inside of the ear, and you've got to be able to deliver the medicine as though you were in person. And so that's sort of the telemedicine portion of it. And again, telehealth from a statutory standpoint in Delaware, this is a bunch of words that basically says that it's everything else. And I don't want to just kind of leave that aside too lightly, because in my mind, as much potential as there is in using technology to make that clinician-patient interaction as best and efficient and in the continuity of care as possible, the telehealth portion of it to me is also deeply exciting, because if medicine is an art, it's always changing, it's expanding all the time. There's a reason that we don't in statute say, Dr. X must do these 3 things for patient Y when they present with these things. It just doesn't make any sense to do it that way. There has to be a lot of discretion and latitude for the evolution of the tools, for the practice of medicine to advance. And so, to my mind, telehealth is actually a great way to spread that knowledge throughout the clinician community. A classic example, or a recent example, I suppose, is like Project Echo has phenomenal sort of like the grand rounds using telehealth, where essentially you can tune in from just about anywhere, and they do fantastic ones on opiate abuse and sort of best practices on how to treat patients that are presenting with addiction. And so that's an area that's evolving all the time because it is such a crisis. And so it's been fantastic to see it as a tool and see the telehealth aspect of it really proliferate. Another thing, coming back to the idea of other. So there are a couple different models out there for telemedicine, really 2 main ones. There's telemedicine as the discrete patient interaction like we've been talking about, and it's really continuity of care through technology. So, I'm in my early 30s. I see my primary care doc in person once a year. But that doesn't mean I only get sick once a year. I just go in for an annual visit. What the continuity of care would be is that if my physician used telemedicine and I got sick along the way, nothing too crazy, what I could do is, rather than go to a walk-in clinic or use a sort of an outside telemedicine product, if my physician used telemedicine, I could speak to my physician without having to go into the office, which can often be scheduled out very far, or it can be very difficult to actually get there. I have busy career, young daughter, that kind of thing. Life gets hectic. And so the point being that inside the continuity of care is probably the best and is the best model of telemedicine. But that doesn't mean that the secondary model, and this is what most people and most practices think of when they think medicine, and unfortunately a lot of insurance companies think this too, and large employers, is this kind of other. And what I mean by that is that most telemedicine companies, if you think of a telemedicine company, it's kind of like the Uber or Lyft of medicine, where you'll have clinicians who basically sign up with a telemedicine company, and they'll agree to take however many telemedicine visits a week, be it by visit or by hour, and they'll kind of sign up and say, I'll give you from 2 to 3 o'clock on Thursday, I'll kind of turn on my light, and patients who call into your network, I will see them. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that model if you think about it in terms of a direct-to-consumer physician is not a new physician. There's not some ghost workforce out there that exists just because we have this direct-to-consumer model. It's really your colleagues. They might even be you. And it's you figuring out where in your schedule, where in your time makes sense, where you can kind of pick up a little side hustle. And it's sort of one and done interactions. And so a patient will call into one of these models, and they'll get connected to a physician. It's not their physician, but it's a physician, not too different than going to a walk-in clinic. And the physician will deliver a discrete service, and then the telemedicine encounter will end, and the patient will go about their business. And if they need a follow-up and they call back, they're going to get a different physician. And so we've completely broken up the continuity of care. We've also added on an additional cost. And so, each one of those visits is probably on average about $40. And so if you're looking at it from an insurer standpoint or a public health advocate or, a governor with a 6% healthcare cost inflation rate, and you're saying, well, this seems like just another thing, it kind of is. It's another thing. I mean, maybe you saved an urgent care visit. Maybe you saved an emergency department visit, but you're not building out your foundation of care, your primary care, with this other model. And so really the only thing that keeps us from having the first model, from having the continuity of care for patients is frankly just adoption and figuring out where to fit it in your workflow of your very own practice. And I'll note there is room for kind of a blend of these two things. So there's a company, for instance, that they make essentially kiosks, and they put them out into public spaces essentially. And so rather than go to a walk-in clinic, a patient will go to one of these kiosks. And the ideal situation is that they go into a kiosk, and this kiosk has a direct connection back to a primary care network and hopefully their primary care. And so there's a chance, at least then at that point, where the patient sort of plugs into this kiosk, and the kiosk is able to identify their practice, their home practice, and connect you back at least the same building. And so there is sort of a middle ground hybrid possibility out there, and I'm sure that there are other models as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about these 4 topics, some billing basics, some licensing and regulations, and some legislation, strategies for your own practice, and a little bit of ethics along the way here. And let's talk quickly about goals. So access, cost, and outcomes are kind of the basic elements that we talk about all the time, be it in an individual practice, be it, again, a big picture, looking out at a healthcare system that works best for a population of a city or a state or even the country. These are kind of the different elements that we're always trying to figure out. And they're all deeply important because medicine still is a business. The cost part is as important as anything else. But we're always looking at, well, what is the best way that we can increase the most services to the most population, the most patients that need them, but then what's going to be the cost of that? And then we're going to ask ourselves, what's the outcome of that? Individual practice standpoint, you're going to be asking yourself, okay, is it efficient? Is it worth it from a reimbursement standpoint? From a public health goal, you're trying to figure out how do you get a healthier population. From a patient standpoint, I'll tell you that I'm looking for convenience. We've all gotten a lot busier, but even on top of that, our population has gotten older and it's gotten sicker. And so if you think older and sicker, it's harder to get around, and it also means much more costly. So, we'll talk about a little bit more later about, sort of telemedicine, healthcare 2.0 in terms of payment structures. But those are kind of the elements that we're all batting around here. So drilling down a little bit and going into the trenches, practices all the good practices especially, will ask me a couple of sort of threshold questions. I mean, of course, is it safe? And so what information is being stored, that's being a savvy practice manager or a savvy clinician is saying, well, I'm a little bit worried about cybersecurity. If it's Equifax or Marriott, we're all kind of hearing about data breaches. What about HIPAA is one of those questions that gets tossed out in just about any healthcare conversation that we've had since the dawn of HIPAA. Those two questions can be hours and hours long of presentations. What I'll leave you with here today, very importantly, is that telemedicine doesn't add too much complication to your life in either of these things. For instance, if you're already using an EMR, which I hope you are, you should be doing your security checks. A lot of the hacking and a lot of the cybersecurity concerns that we have these days aren't sort of the brute force hacking, like the Russians aren't trying to break your firewall. It's more phishing. So people pretending that they're patients, people who are hopping onto your unsecured Wi-Fi. It's really sort of more of meat and potato things that you should be thinking about anyway. You'll hear the term a lot, like, oh, is this HIPAA compliant? And I can tell you from a practice standpoint and from a compliance standpoint, HIPAA compliance is really based around the people. It's about the users and not the technology. The technology, you can ask if it's HIPAA secure, but really from that perspective, you're really looking for like basic encryption. I mean, most of the time, like FaceTime will have the level of encryption that you need. And if you're going out and you're finding a telemedicine vendor that's going to come in and help build your platform, again, which are very inexpensive, they will make sure that the encryption is there. And most of the time, a lot of these things, from a compliance standpoint, what HIPAA is going to be looking for is accountability. So the encryption is kind of the safe conduit from one place where protected health information, PHI, it lives, to another place, so point A to point B, telemedicine kind of being the conduit. If it's encrypted, you basically check the box on the HIPAA security, and then they're going to want to ask to make sure that from an accountability standpoint, your practice is kind of being point A, or probably point B, but the point being that on either end of that conduit, they're going to want you to have some sort of business associate agreement, a BAA, to make sure that there's accountability on either side. But for a lot of telemedicine, HIPAA has this carve-out exception where if you're simply the conduit, they care that you're secure, but if you're not holding any of the information, they don't particularly care that you have a BAA. But I will tell you, as a best practice, you should have a BAA with everybody. But Apple's probably not going to sign a BAA with you, and that's okay. But if you're storing patient information on a cloud, you've got an Amazon cloud, they will. They have the tools to do that. Peripherals, so a lot of telemedicine, if you want to get, depending on the type of medicine you have, they make amazing and affordable peripheral tools, and all that is really is a HIPAA secure tool that goes out into the patient world, and you don't have to be at the practice, but let's say you've got a nurse or a medical assistant on the other end, they can take this peripheral tool, like an otoscope or whatever, and they can use it on the patient and have that information come back to you live time. So the point being that there's amazing technology tools that are also, because of the proliferation and the investment, have become very affordable. And I really can't harp on this third point enough. What is standard of care? And really, again, telemedicine is not an other. There is no separate. You're never going to take a board in telemedicine. Telemedicine is simply the technology, which means that your standard of care is going to be the exact same as if you were practicing in person. And really, if you use that as your guiding principle, no matter what you do, it's really hard to go wrong in a telemedicine program. So again, whenever you have a question on whether or not you can do something, is that standard of care, just flip around and ask yourself, what a minimally competent physician or similarly positioned clinician, would they do this? And if you think that answer is yes, then you can probably do it. And it is much broader than you think once you start to think it through. The next big question, especially if you're a doctor, you are concerned about your ethics. The AMA, we're not going to read all this, but the AMA has fantastic guidance out there. The specialty societies themselves have great guidance out there. I definitely recommend checking that out. And the specialty societies themselves also have, a lot of them now have telemedicine specific guidance. And again, the beauty of the guidelines is that they're changing all the time. So I definitely recommend that you just keep light tabs on that sort of thing. So Delaware in 2015, this is former Governor Markell. He was term limited out. Is signing our House Bill 69 here. Delaware became, I think we were the second state, but now a lot of states have followed us to have a bill that had a couple very important components that we'll talk about. Payment parity being one of them. So every practice and every practice manager is always curious how they're going to get paid for this, which is absolutely appropriate. And the second piece was really about patient safety and trying to create kind of guidance overall and kind of the bumpers on this telemedicine freeway. And so as an example of some of the language here, again, wordy, I understand. This is our Delaware's basic definition of establishing the physician-patient relationship. So several slides ago, I showed you Delaware's telemedicine law, like the definition of telemedicine and the definition of telehealth, and this is kind of how you use it. And so Delaware, we expect you to build some sort of physician-patient relationship. There are 4 ways to do it. I mean, the gold standard from the continuity of care standpoint is that you're seeing a patient that you already know. I have a relationship with my primary care doctor. If my primary care doctor adopts telemedicine, I'm able to use it with them. We've clearly established a relationship, and that's great. The second piece is, the second option is you've got a Delaware licensed practitioner basically with the patient at the time of the diagnosis. And so a good way to think about this is that if you are a physician who's overseeing a couple different sites, you have a couple of advanced practice nurses and a couple PAs. If you have a patient at one of those sites and you're they're at site A with your PA and you're at site B, as long as the PA is there to kind of help be your eyes and ears and your prodder, that's enough to kind of establish the relationship. You're going to fit through the statute and you can do a telemedicine visit. The third option is probably the most proliferating. This is the audio visual. Delaware regulation makes it very clear that a phone only is never going to be enough. So if you've never talked to this patient before, you've never met a patient, you cannot establish a physician-patient relationship just using the phone. And so Delaware is very clear to do that in statute. And then the fourth piece, and this is where it got a little bit sticky at one point, and we can address that more later if there's time, was if you're following clinical practice guidelines, if you're following evidence-based clinical practice guidelines developed by a major specialty society, so that's a whole one big thought. If the American Academy of Psychiatry puts out a guideline and you're a psychiatrist, you're allowed to follow that. And so if there are certain situations where a phone-only interaction might be okay for a first visit, and you've got the evidence-based guidelines to back that up, we're going to let you do it. Again, because telemedicine and medicine adapts so fast, we did want to leave some room in the statute. Mechanically, there are mechanical steps in Delaware statute as well to establishing a relationship, and they're really kind of intuitive once you unpack it. So you want to know where the patient is, you want to know where you are, you want to tell them who you are and what you are, so you're a doctor or you're a nurse or a PA. You want appropriate consents. And so there's some, as much as the standard of care and the medicine is the same, a telemedicine consent may do something like, kind of jumping down to number 5 here. You want to make sure that there's backup. You want to make sure that there's places for people to go. So if there's a power outage or if the call drops because you got spotty service, you just want to make sure that the patient's aware of that ahead of time. It's sort of discreet and really kind of nominal risks to the technology itself that you'd want to put out there. Number 3, standard of care is still going to matter. Number 4 is you're discussing and walking your patient through it. And then we talked number 5, and number 6 is really, and this comes back to, we always wanted to make sure that even if the patient was choosing to go to, again, kind of that urgent care model, that direct-to-consumer model of telemedicine, we wanted the opportunity, one, for the patient to have their own information. So after that visit was over, you have to give a written summary. And ideally, the DIN in Delaware is the Delaware Health Information Network. And this is a vast oversimplification. It does way more than this, but it's sort of our community health record. So the ideal idea was if we can get the care summaries at least into the DIN, there's a good chance that the practice can later find it. So the primary care doctor can go find that interaction. And so the idea is we were really trying and still are really trying to make sure that continuity of care is the gold standard. And we're constantly trying to figure out the best thing to do. So back in 2016, a year after we passed that initial bill, we wanted to make it very clear that we weren't trying to impede anything about the traditional practice of pathology and radiology, as we talked about before, taking an X-ray and shooting it over. We wanted to make sure that still worked. Once you establish the relationship, we wanted to make it very clear that, again, coming back to the very common and existing practice where, if you see a patient in person and you've followed up by a phone call, we want to be absolutely clear that that's completely fine. In fact, it's encouraged. We want practices to be following up with their patients without having to worry about the telemedicine statute. In the future, Delaware is really, like everywhere, is really struggling with an opiate crisis still, an addiction crisis. We've been trying to figure out how do we use medically assisted treatment and telemedicine. There is a narrow avenue right now in our regs that you might consider if you're a policymaker in another state, which basically allows our health and social services to bless a telemedicine program, to say, yes, we trust you to be able to prescribe opiates, because a medically assisted treatment is basically treating an opiate with an opiate. And right now there's a complete ban on opiates in telemedicine in Delaware, at least. So we're trying to create safe avenues for that. And then also on-call language. Some other states have struggled with this, where there were some questionable models out there that were allowing patients to designate a certain physician as an on-call physician. A little bit of a rabbit hole, but the point being that there is a very legitimate purpose and a very easy purpose for patients being able to follow up with colleagues in the same practice. So, Dr. X and Dr. Y work together. Dr. X's patient, needs access to that practice, and Dr. X isn't there. Rather than forcing them into an urgent care, we want to make sure that if that practice is ready to do telemedicine, that Dr. Y can pick it up and be able to help cover that patient. And so we're trying to figure out the best way to work that into the statute and just make it very clear that we do want continuity of care in telemedicine in Delaware. Probably the most important part for all the people on this call, payment. Payment is the constant question. Delaware is one of the few states that really specifically calls for parity. And so there are a lot of states that have been struggling with this. We had policymakers coming to us and saying, I don't understand why telemedicine would be as expensive as a brick and mortar visit. You're not using the building. There's not a lot of staff. It's just this discrete sort of bare bones interaction. And there's a lot sort of baked in there. So again, there's not some separate workforce up in the clouds. the workforce that we have are the workforce that we have. So these doctors are doctors that are in practices that are figuring out when they can sort of participate in one of these models. So there is a brick and mortar to it. And secondarily, and probably the most from a policy perspective, is that we're going to get what we pay for. And this is not some snarky throwaway comment. What I mean by it is, if you don't pay, as a policymaker, if you don't pay at least the same rate for the exact same medicine, because again, we're paying for, ideally, the clinician's expertise, their diagnostic ability, all that training, their boards, all of this. We've got a very specialized person who we're trusting to diagnose. And so if we're not paying for that, first off, the medicine is the same, so you're paying for the same service in theory. But almost more importantly, if you drop the reimbursement for telemedicine, you're creating a disincentive for existing practices to work this into their continuity of care. And in fact, the way that we worded it was that if a savvy insurer wanted to create a primary care telemedicine program, we gave them room to pay more. Like if you want to incentivize to give room for practices to really want to do this, we gave room for that. But at least you've got to pay the same, because if you're paying anything less, then all you're doing is creating an incentive for practices to join direct-to-consumer models where they're just turning on the light and getting 20 bucks and going home. They need to, if you're earnestly trying to work it out from a policy perspective and build telemedicine into especially your primary care infrastructure, you have to have parity. So Michigan, for instance, when they passed their parity law, they saw something like a 77 to 78% increase in telemedicine visits. So parity is deeply impactful. So as much as I give on that one, I have to take a little bit away, unfortunately. So the really bad news is that any state law can only go so far. So we can, so through your various insurance codes, no matter what state you're in, like the state of Delaware, the state of New York, the state of Texas, Oklahoma, and none of us can tell Medicare what to do. And so Medicare's got its own program, it's got its own patient population. Delaware cannot say to Medicare, thou shalt pay parity for telemedicine. Nor can we tell ERISA plan. So if you're a large self-insured plan, we can't tell you what to do either because you're protected from federal law standpoint. We can tell our Medicaid program what to do, and Delaware, we asked. And actually Medicaid sort of jumped on the bandwagon before we even finished the bill. So Medicaid was already paying for telemedicine, which was fantastic. We can ask. The state of Delaware is one of the biggest employers in the state, so we can ask or tell them and say, hey, listen, we really want you to be part of this. Can you bring your lives in, and can you adopt a telemedicine parity? There's also a statute where you can tell them to do that, but hearts and minds are good. And then we can tell the commercial market and the marketplace what to do as well. And so in Delaware's parity law, we reached probably half the population, which is great. From a practice standpoint, it does mean that there's a little inconsistency where if your patient's coming in and they're handing you an insurance card, you've got a little due diligence to do to figure out, okay, what kind of plan is that patient in? Am I getting a card from a large employer, or am I getting a card from a commercial payer? So there's just a little bit of background to do, and that can be a deterrent. But I encourage you to kind of fight your way through that, especially if you're in a state like Delaware, where our hospital systems have been fighting really hard to try to build those clear pathways. And just because we can't tell ERISA plans what to do, we've actually been working really hard in Delaware to approach those plans and say, this makes sense for you. I mean, you want your workforce to be able to access telemedicine services inside of the practice that they're already seeing. That it makes perfect sense from a policy and population standpoint. It will be a cost, it'll drive your trend down as opposed to being an additive service, because a lot of employers, not really understanding the nuance here, they're going out and just signing a contract with a telemedicine service because they went to Google and typed in telemedicine, and so they know that it's important for some reason, and so they go out and they get a contract, but they haven't actually solved the problem. But education, it goes a long way. In a state like Delaware, we can do that. Larger states, I mean, I would sort of pick your prizes. Your Chamber of Commerce might be a good place to start. And one way or the other, I got to tell you that this problem is really a moment in time. So even Medicare does not cover telemedicine at all in Delaware. It might in your larger states, because the threshold question that Medicare cares about is if you're rural or not. And so nowhere in Delaware, and there's a secondary question on if you're a healthcare provider shortage area, HIPAA, and nowhere in Delaware qualifies even over the rural designation. There's 0 rural designations in Delaware. Upstate New York, where I'm originally from, I'm actually from the Adirondacks, which is woods, and that's all rural. And so my parents actually live 7 minutes from a hospital, and they live across the street from their primary care doctor. But Medicare will pay for that. But they won't in southern Delaware, where we have farmers that live hours away from care. And Medicare just hasn't gotten over this initial sort of threshold question that really, from a telemedicine program standpoint, it's not the distance in terms of miles that matters, it's the barriers in people's lives. So if you have a patient who's bedridden, they could be down the street, but the likelihood of them and the difficulty of them being able to make their way down to you, like that's really what we're trying to address. We're trying to overcome these types of barriers. And one way or the other, moving into the future, we're moving away from a fee-for-service. I think fee-for-service will always be an element in any model that we go to, but as you become more responsible for keeping your patient population healthy, you're going to want to make sure that your population is taking their medication. You're going to want to make sure that the treatment that is working. You want to be available to ensure that your patient doesn't go back into the hospital in the middle of the night. And telemedicine is going to be the way that you're going to do that. It's going to be the technology that connects you to your patient population. And so if you're able, in the fee-for-service model world that we're in still for the moment, if you're able to start to adopt some of this and start to troubleshoot and figure out how do you work it in your workflow, because every practice that I meet with now is completely slammed. There's no shortage of patients out there. And so there's not a lot of reason when you're going a million miles an hour to try to figure out how do you work this into your workflow until you pause for a second and try to think about what your expectations are going to be as soon as a year from now or 2 years, maybe even a year in Delaware. And so if you stop and ask yourself that question of, well, what am I going to be judged on as a practice? Then you start to see why telemedicine is important, how it's going to fit in, and you're going to really want to think about these big picture questions. So you're going to want your enhanced access to care. If you're an NCQA, PCMH, if you're a patient-centered medical home, if you're getting judged on these things, these are different steps. And these are things that you're going to want to be thinking about when you're thinking about if telemedicine is right for you. And I've never run across a practice who's actually paused to think about how telemedicine is important for where they're going to be. No one has said, no, it's just not going to work for me. Everyone's like, oh, wait, I have to think about, even like discrete patients. Like I just have a smaller subset of my population that I want to be able to talk to and connect with. Telemedicine is going to be the way to do that. So it really is just hitting the pause button, even though you're going a million miles an hour, and just trying to figure out why this makes sense, and it inevitably does. So you're going to think through how do you actually do it, where are you going to put it into your day. Patient cancellations, this is a great way to kind of connect with patients that you're trying to follow up with. Just think about how this can work for you. And ultimately, this really is about the patient and the population. We need to be making sure the data is very clear that a robust, especially primary care system, but access to care generally, and the consistent continuity of care style, sort of traditional medicine that we think about, that's the gold standard. And we have insane healthcare cost growth rates. And if we're able to build this primary care infrastructure and a continuity of care with warm handoffs, if we're able to integrate behavioral health into primary care so that a patient comes into primary care and instead of being referred out, you can actually do this warm handoff or even a first visit with the services that they need on the spot. Just thinking about it from a patient standpoint, it makes all the sense in the world. And so I know that we're running out of time here, so I want to make sure that we're able to take a few questions. So Catherine, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Drew. I really appreciate it. That was a really wonderful presentation. And we do have a few questions, so I wanted to get to those. The first one was, you touched on some the role of regulations and guidelines. Can you revisit that briefly? For instance, guidelines and practice standards as opposed to regulations and statute.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we talked a lot about Delaware's law today. I didn't show any of the legalese about the regs, but a good way to think about it is that the laws and the regs kind of create the rules of the game. And so you've got a legislature that says, we want to make sure that telemedicine either proliferates, or if you could even have a legislature that views telemedicine very hostilely, but they create the rules of the game. Then the regulations get proliferated by, your local board of medical licensure, your division of professional regulation, and they get a little bit more discreet. But setting all of that aside, really, the standard of care is what matters. It is really, I know I've said it a couple times, and I honestly cannot say it enough. And so your guidelines, your professional guidelines are going to be deeply important. Stay on top of that, be talking to your colleagues, looking for ways that you can share best practices amongst yourselves, because standard of care is not static either, it changes. So as the tools change and clinicians find innovative ways to use telemedicine and reach patients, that standard of care is going to adapt over time. And so those guidelines are going to be what's best reflective. And as a very brief caution, there was a time, especially in Delaware, where there were separate telemedicine like handbooks that were coming around, and physicians were relying on, especially physicians, but other clinicians as well, were relying on them and saying, okay, well, this is I've been given this sort of telemedicine handbook, and like this is my Bible, kind of forgetting the touchstone that telemedicine again is not an other. And so these books have been sort of cobbled together, kind of like a Franken guideline. And so one of the regs that Delaware had to pass was to make it very clear that it's not about pulling a page from one book and a page from another book and kind of pulling guidelines out of context. There are groups out there that have focused and thoughtful arcs of medicine and how it interacts with the new tools of telemedicine. And so really just, so as much as guidelines are important, who's writing them are also very important.
Okay, good. So we shouldn't be using Franken guidelines. I like that. Yeah. Okay, so good. So looking toward the future, could you play futurist for a moment? What do you see? Where do you see the space going next? Since you're in this all the time, where do you see it going in the next decade?
Yeah, I think what's going to be most important is that our small practices, Delaware, our primary care in particular, is still delivered mostly by independent practices, something like 70%. I know that's not true everywhere, and this is not an us versus them in terms of employed or small practice. The point being that I think as soon as our primary care infrastructure sort of jumps into this space and is able to recognize, oh yeah, like when Mrs. Jones comes in, I've been really worried about, I'm worried about maybe she's suffering symptoms of dementia. I want to make sure that when Mrs. Jones is in front of me, I can connect her automatically inside of my practice to a psychiatrist, to her cardiologist, to the pharmacy, and so that while I'm sitting there, I can make sure that Mrs. Jones or even just like a patient coordinator, they have a whole separate profession that's now burgeoning on these navigators, just making sure that telemedicine fits for Mrs. Jones. I really think that as soon as our foundational infrastructure figures out that this is the way to go, and again, it's so hard from their perspective because they are just completely overwhelmed. I really feel for them. But as soon as they figure out how this works and how it's both worth it economically, which it absolutely is, and worth it for patient care, and that ultimately as their patient population gets healthier and better, that in payment 2.0 or 18.0, depending on how you're counting, that's where the value is going to come in, and that's where you're going to really see continuity of care telemedicine take off, and that's when we're going to start to see our cost of care trend lines drop. And so I really think that it's coming in a very positive way.
Great. Okay, so do you see distinctions between the setting for telemedicine, maybe a hospital system versus a small practice?
Yeah, so not necessarily in the implementation, because again, the medicine should be consistent. But what will change is that hospital systems, I think, could be leading the way because they have the administrative resources. So they have the people behind the desks who can take the time to go rail on the insurers and be like, no, really, the law says you have to pay for this, you have to pay for this. If you're in a small practice, that gets onerous pretty quickly. And so I really think that the medicine should be completely the same, but I think it's almost incumbent upon our systems in the areas to take a little bit of their administrative time and for the betterment of whatever state they're in, whatever community they're in, they should be the ones banging on the doors, figuring out how to create consistent payment conduits between payer and clinician and practice. And so and it makes perfect sense for them too. It's not just a question of being magnanimous, but they're the ones who should be really taking the time now and forging the way.
Okay. All right. Generally, are there practical tips or pointers that you frequently give practices you can call upon when you're asking about how they are, on the ground or in the trenches using telemed?
Yeah, so it's always going to be practice to practice. So I talk primary care a lot because I'm a big believer in primary care. I think that's kind of the answer to a lot of our systemic woes. But if you're I talked about that asthma program, but there's similar remote patient monitoring in ortho or in cardiology. I have a lot of surgeons who come up to me and say, well, telemedicine doesn't make any sense for me. Like, I can't cut somebody open with a cell phone. Like, you're absolutely right, and you shouldn't try. Please don't. But there's a lot of things that you can do around it. I mean, there's that discrete interaction, there's that surgery, but there's all the stuff before, and there's especially all the stuff after. And so, recovery is almost as important. So you want to make sure that your patient has access to all the answers to the questions that they have, so they don't go back in the hospital. If they are going through PT and maybe the PT isn't working, but they don't know how to have that conversation, they want to be able to connect back with you. You want to make sure that the follow-ups, even though you're not necessarily billing for it, depending on your model and who you are, you want to make sure that patient is getting the care that they need, because ultimately it is going to come back to you. And so you want to think about it kind of how the patient comes in and how the patient comes out. And so the point being that even in surgery, even in dentistry, there are uses for telemedicine that are going to be very important for population health and for patient follow-ups. And you should really just think sort of flexibly and innovatively about this.
Great. And do you have any other final bits of advice? I think we're about ready to wrap up. I think we're getting to our time. So I wanted to thank you so much for being here. But did you have any other final bits of advice for us?
Sure, just be bold. Again, it's in the inundated medical world that we're in right now, where everybody's going really fast and we've all got a million things to do. Take the moment, figure out how this works for you, have an open mind. Resist the knee jerk to be like, it's just another headache. It's really not. It's really not. You have to think about your patient population, think about how it works, and just a little bit of time now. If you're in a fee-for-service model and you're not even in a parity state, figuring out how it can work for you, how it can work for your practice and for your patients is absolutely going to pay dividends. Wonderful.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. I know that our attendees, if you have other questions, make sure that you use the contact information on the screen to get in touch with Drew. If you have questions, further questions, you can also contact us and we'll forward those questions on. But I really want to thank you so much, Drew, for being here. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Attendees, if you have any questions, as I said, you can forward those on. Please remember that your PACOM and PMI CEU certificate will be emailed to you within 2 days following the broadcast. There's no need to request it. You can register for future webinars and request a demo of our compliance solution on our website at firsthcc.com or call us at 888-543-4778. And thank you for joining us.